Hello and welcome to this video. So before we get started with the actual content, I thought I would just introduce what this is. And this is a segment from a course that I created for the website Udemy, which is a introduction to Git, GitHub, and GitHub Actions, and how these three tools work extremely well together to maintain version control over repositories, and also for CI pipelines and software development teams. These three tools are very useful. So it's a course that introduces these three tools. If you've never worked with them before, or you want to look into them and get an idea of how they work, you can find that course on Udemy. It's entirely free. So I've linked it in the description below. The entire course is also available here on YouTube. I've also linked a course that I created that focuses specifically on GitHub Actions. So if you want to dive deep into GitHub Actions itself, you can find a link to that course in the description as well. So I hope this video will be very helpful for you, and if you find the content is useful, please do like the video and perhaps subscribe to the channel to look for more course content in the future. Hello and welcome to this new section all about GitHub. So now that we've seen Git and how you can use it on your local machine, we want to look at GitHub, which is the online presence for Git. It's where you get to collaborate with your team members or other people working on the same project or the same repository that you are working on. So what we're going to do in this section is look first at how GitHub works, some of its features, some of its benefits, and then we're going to create a GitHub repository, which we're going to pull to your local machine so that we can start making changes and seeing how you can work with GitHub from your local machine, how the two work together. Hello and welcome to this lecture. So now that we've learned about Git and we've played with it a bit on our local machine to get a feel for how it works, we're going to move on to GitHub now. In this session, I want to look at what GitHub is, how it integrates with Git, and some of the benefits of using it, and also just give you a basic example. And I'll also just show you how the GitHub user interface looks. In the next session, we'll start playing with GitHub, but this session is about just introducing. So let's get started. So what is GitHub? GitHub is a cloud-based platform that hosts your Git repositories. Think of it as an online home for your code. And having your code stored in this online home allows you to not only store them securely, it also allows you to share them with others. It allows your teammates to collaborate from anywhere that they can access that repository. And you can track changes and review code, review changes that other teammates make that they want to merge to the main branch of that repository. And GitHub is built on top of Git, which means it integrates seamlessly with the Git commands that you've already learned. So here as an example is the homepage for the GitHub UI, github.com. And you can see just a few things here. I don't want you to learn anything here just yet. I'm just kind of showing you how it looks. There are some different repositories listed on the side here, and the way that they're listed is the user who owns the repository. In this case, it's myself, E. Terhoven, and then the name of the repository. And then there are some other interesting blocks here of various types of information. Now let's look at a particular repository just to get a bit more information. Let's look at this repository. This is the repository I used when creating my course on GitHub Actions. So here you have the main page of a particular repository. You can see the folders that are in this repository and some files too. There's some information here on the side about releases, the types of coding languages found in this repository. GitHub works this out on its own. And there's all sorts of tabs on top here for things that you can look at or do, modify or change within this repository. So that's kind of how the GitHub UI looks, just to give you kind of an idea. Okay, so let's look at some key features of GitHub. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, remote repositories. Because you're storing your code in GitHub servers, it is accessible from anywhere. And given how many workplaces are working remotely these days, this allows your users, your engineers, and your teammates to access that code from anywhere where they have an internet connection. This also facilitates collaboration tools. You can work easily with teams using features like pull requests where you review code, you can have discussions, you can create issues, so you can work together on the same code base from pretty much anywhere. Issue tracking is another key feature. This allows you to keep track of bugs or tasks and feature requests directly in the repository that it relates to. So it's in the same space. It's not in some random other place in documentation or something. It's in the same space as the repository itself. Now, speaking of documentation, there is also documentation support in GitHub itself. You can use README files or wikis to provide context about the project, to provide how to do sections, anything like that. Useful documentation that users might need or which might help them use whatever is in that repository. And finally, version control history. You can view and manage the entire history of the project, including every commit and every branch. So why use GitHub? Well, there are many good reasons to use GitHub, but here are just a few. Firstly, collaboration is made very easy with GitHub. It simplifies teamwork because everything is accessible from anywhere. You can be in the same office, you can be on opposite sides of the planet, but you can still work together. For portfolio building, GitHub can also be useful. You can use your GitHub profile to serve as a portfolio to showcase your skills. And this is particularly useful if you're looking for employment. You can actually share a link to a repository or some part of your GitHub profile where a potential employer can see what you've done. Third, we have integration with other tools. GitHub does integrate with a wide range of tools like CI/CD systems, GitHub Actions being the easiest because it's already part of the system, but we'll talk about that later. Development environments, project management platforms, pretty much anything. GitHub is able to integrate with pretty much any development and management environment. Fourth, we have community and open source. GitHub hosts millions of open source projects that you can make use of yourself if you want to at no cost. You can learn from others, you can contribute to those existing projects, you can start your own projects. GitHub encourages working with the community to create better tools. And finally, backup and accessibility. Storing your projects on GitHub means that they're safe and they're accessible even if something happens on your local machine. You know you can get your latest version of the code from GitHub at any point. So how does Git integrate with GitHub? Well, your local repository is the project that you have on your computer and you manage that with Git, similar to how we saw in the previous section. The remote repository is the online version of your project and that's hosted on GitHub. So you can sync changes using Git commands like git push or git pull or git fetch to synchronize your local and remote repositories to make sure that you're always up to date. And finally, as we've said many times already in this course, collaboration. When you're working with others, GitHub helps you manage and merge changes effectively and safely. The way that this works is that each user who's working on the same repository is working with Git on their local system, and GitHub manages how changes are pushed to the online version of that repository, using pull requests and version history and so on. So, as an example, let's say you're building a personal website. You can create a GitHub repository to host your code in the GitHub space. You can work on your local machine and then push those changes to your GitHub repository. You can then share the repository link with collaborators or even make it public so that anybody can look at it and provide feedback or even modify it. And you can use GitHub Pages to host your website for free directly from the repository. And that's it for this lecture. In the next session, we're going to start playing with GitHub by creating our first repository. I'll see you there. Hello and welcome to this lecture. So now that we've looked a little bit at what GitHub is and how it works and some of its many advantages, we should take some time now to create our first GitHub repository. In the previous section, when we were playing with Git, we created local repositories, or rather we initialized local repositories. But what we want to do now is create one in the GitHub cloud, which we can then fetch from GitHub and work with on our local machine, and then take whatever we've made our changes and send it back to GitHub. So this lecture is focusing on creating that repository and then having a bit of a look around at what we've created before we move to actually pulling it and making some changes. So let's get started. So just as a refresher, what is a repository? I've thrown this word around a few times in this course. A repository, or repo for short, is a storage space in GitHub where your project's files and the version history live. Think of it as a digital workspace for your code, for your documentation, or for any other project-related files. And as we've already said in this course, there is a continuous history of all the different versions, all the changes made to this repository. Now, a repository can either be public, which means it's visible to anyone on GitHub, and anybody can fetch it, can propose changes to it, can fork it, etc., which is great for open source projects, for tools that are made for anybody to use. Or repositories can be private, which is only accessible to you and to people you invite. And this is ideal for personal or sensitive projects. And of course, in organizations, repositories tend to be private because the code that the organization writes is private to that organization. You don't want it to be on the public internet. So I'm assuming that you've already created a GitHub account, which was in section 1 of this course. So with your GitHub account in place, let's go and create a private repository that we can use for the rest of this section. So I'm on the home page of GitHub. You can see I'm signed into my account here. And if you see any blurred sections on screen, that's just because that is relevant to the organization that I'm signed in with, and that is not necessary for this course. So those you don't have to really worry about. So to create a new repository is very simple. We can just go to this new button over here. And this will take us to this create new repository page. So if you have more than one owner available to you, you probably won't, but if you do, you can choose which owner you want to make the owner of that repository. It will probably just be whichever username you created, which is what I've got there, Eterhoven. And let's call our repository anything you want, really. I'm going to call this Intro to Git. And Intro to Git, thankfully, is available. And you can give it a description if you want. I'm going to say this repository is for the Introduction to Git course, like that. Now you can choose if you want, let me just add my S there, there we go. You can choose if you want this repository to be public, so anybody can see it, or if you want it to be private. I'm going to make it private, because it's only for me and for anybody who I choose to allow to see it. You can also make a few other changes here. You can add a README file, which is always good to add. I'm going to add one. You can also have a .gitignore, which will tell Git when to ignore certain files or folders. I'm not going to make any changes there, and I'm just not going to choose any licenses. I'm just going to add the README file, and now we can click Create Repository. And now we have a repository, Intro to Git, and as we can see, it's a private repository. So let's have a little bit of a look around on our main screen here. We don't really have much to go on. We've got a README file, as you see, and the README file would be displayed on this main page here. So if it did have content in it, you'd see it here. And that's really why the README is useful to have, because it allows you to create some sort of landing page for your repository that any collaborators or other team members can see. There's an about section here, which has essentially got our description in it, and some information on releases and packages and things that we haven't really done anything with yet. If there'd been any forks of this repository, we would see it here. If anybody had favorited this repository, we'd see it here. So this is really like your landing page. Now on top, we've got a few tabs that we could look at. We have an issues tab, which is if this was a team or an open repository and there were problems, a user could create a new issue here and basically make that issue open to other collaborators to see if they can fix it. We have pull requests, and pull requests is something we're going to use in this section. This is how we can propose a change to the repository, something we want to add or remove or modify. This is usually done through a pull request, and we'll see how that works. When we get to actions in a little while, we'll see how GitHub Actions work, and we'll actually not see this page. Once we've added a workflow, we'll actually see the workflows that we add, and we'll see how they run. So we'll get to this one. And then there's a few other tabs here which aren't really too important right now. We have projects, we have security, which we don't need to really play with right now. There's some insights, and of course there are settings for the repository itself, all sorts of things here on the side. So there's a lot here that you can learn about, and I would encourage you in your private repository to go and scratch around and look at these different tabs and different sections. There are some good descriptions for most of them, and you can get an idea of what they will do. So now we have our repository in place. In the next lecture, we're going to clone this repository to our local machine. We're going to open it in our text editor that you downloaded or installed in section 1, and we're going to make some changes, and then we're going to create a pull request in order to propose those changes to the repository essentially, and see how we would open that pull request and then merge it. We're going to see how to do all of that in the next lecture. I'll see you there. Hello and welcome to this lecture. Now in this session, I would like to show you 3 ways that you can take a repository that exists on GitHub and pull it to your local machine so that you can start making changes. So let's jump in and see what those methods are and when to use them. So the first method I'd like to talk about is forking a repository. This is useful if you are not the owner of the repository. For example, a public repository that's open source, perhaps you want to fork it in order to create your own version of it and work on that own version without affecting or proposing changes to the original version. So as an example, here is an actions runner controller tool. This is a public repository. Doesn't matter what this is right now. Because it's public, we have the option to fork it. And you can actually see down here, it's been forked 1,200 times already, so pretty popular. Now, how would we do it? It's actually very simple. There is a fork button here on the main screen, and you can either click on fork, or you can click the down arrow and create a new fork. You can have more than one fork for the same original repository. So I'm just going to click on fork, and you can see here you have all the options available to you for creating your new fork. So you can give it a completely different name, which can be any name you want it to be really, and you can give it a different description. It can be whatever you want, and then you can choose if you only copy the main branch of that repository or copy all the branches. That's entirely up to you. I'm not going to make a copy of this now, but this is just to show you how you would do it. Now, all that the fork would do is put your forked repository, your new one that you create, it would put it into your GitHub account. It wouldn't put it onto your local machine. In order to get any repository from GitHub to your local machine, whether it's one that you've created or whether it's a forked repository, you need to clone it. And that's what we're going to look at next. So I'm back with the repository that we created in the previous lecture, which in my case is this Intro to Git repository. And I want to clone this to my local machine. Now, there are a few ways that you could do this, and if you click this green code button, you can see some of those methods. You can clone it using any of these 3 methods here. So the HTTPS link, you can use an SSH link, or you can use a GitHub CLI. And then there is GitHub Desktop, which I'm going to show you in a moment, and you can download the zip if you wish to do so. I'm going to show you how you can use the HTTPS link and also how you can use GitHub Desktop. So to use the HTTPS link, we would do the following. I'm going to copy this link first, and then I'm going to move to my terminal on my local machine. Now in section 1 of this course, there was an article for logging into your GitHub account through Git on your local machine, and I'm assuming you've already done this. Just as a refresher, that would have been the git auth login command, which I'm not going to run now, but then you can log into your github.com account, and this way you're sort of linking your local Git with your online GitHub account. So make sure you've got your login details in place, otherwise you might run into some issues when trying to pull a private repository. Now, you can store this repository wherever you want. I have all of my GitHub repositories stored in the same place on my system, which is in documents and then in a GitHub folder. So I'm going to navigate to that GitHub folder. And now I can use the git clone command to go and fetch this repository. And I would do that by saying git clone, and then this link that I copied here, I would basically just paste there like that. And as you can see, I've now copied that Intro to Git repository is now on my local machine. And now I'll be able to open it in a text editor and start making changes to it. So this is how you can use the git clone command and the HTTPS link, assuming that you are logged in and have permissions to fetch this repository. You could also fetch this repository using GitHub Desktop. Now I can't do that for this particular repository because I've already cloned it, but I've created a second repository here just for this example. And so you can see GitHub desktop is here on my system. I'm currently logged into the GitHub Actions Learning repository, which was my repository for the GitHub Actions course that I created. And all I need to do in the repository that I want to clone is click Open with GitHub Desktop. And then it will ask you for the path, which I'm going to leave as it is, and click Clone. And give it a little bit of time. And now I'm on GitHub Desktop example, and I'm on the main branch. So from here, I can do a number of things. I could create a new branch. I could look at pull requests. There's a fair amount that you can do from here, and you can even open your text editor, which in my case is Visual Studio Code. You can find the repository in your local Windows Explorer or Finder on a Mac, and you can even open up the repository on GitHub. So this is a very quick way of cloning your repository using GitHub Desktop. So we've looked at three methods then in this lecture. You can fork a repository, which is useful if it's a repository that you don't own. And then once you fork that repository, you can clone it using either method that I've showed you or one of the other methods available in this tab here, such as downloading the zip, SSH, or GitHub CLI. If it's a repository that you already own, you don't need to fork it. You can just clone it, and once it's on your machine, you can start playing with it. And that's what we're going to look at in the next lecture. I'll see you there. Hello and welcome to this lecture. Now, we've already created a new repository in your GitHub account, and we have now cloned that repository to your local machine. In this session, we're going to look at how we can now add something or make some change in that repository, and then safely propose those changes so that the other teammates or other collaborators on that repository, of course right now there aren't any, but assuming there were, can then review it before we merge it to the main branch. So imagine this scenario. You're part of an organization or a team of friends and you're working on the same repository. You have a task, something that you need to clean up or fix or modify, or you have a new idea and you think this would be really nice to add, but you can't play with the main version of the code or the main branch of the code because that's the code that's currently running in production, wherever your app or your tool is working right now. So how do you go about making your change and showing it to your other team members so that they can decide if they like it or not, and then choose if they're going to make it part of the main code? That is the process we're going to outline and practice in this lecture, starting from the very first step, which is to create a branch for your code, right up to the final step, which is when we finally merge those changes to the main branch of our code. So let's get started. Okay, so there are a number of ways that you could take your cloned repository and open it in your text editor, depending on whether you're using the terminal or GitHub Desktop, and also the text editor that you're using. I can show you the examples that you can follow if you're using the same tools I am, in this case Visual Studio Code, but if you are using a different editor, just do an online search if you get stuck to figure out what command or what you need to use. So let's start with the terminal first. And as you can see, I'm in my repository, Intro to Git, and I'm on the main branch. So if I want to make some changes that I want to propose to the team, I want to do that on a different branch. So I'm going to use the git switch command that we learned about in the previous section to both create a branch and then switch to that branch that I've created. And I'm going to call it, whatever you want. I'm going to call it proposed changes. And now I've moved to the proposed changes branch. Now from here, I can open Visual Studio using the code command, and the full stop will just open the whole repository. So there's my repository, and now I can go and make some changes here, right? So this is the one method. The other method could also be with GitHub Desktop. Now let's go here to Intro to Git. You can see, because I've changed the branch, GitHub Desktop has already picked it up and has moved to the proposed changes branch, because that's the one that I'm currently on. If I was back on the main branch, let's assume I hadn't created a branch yet. I could go new branch, call it something else, like that, and create that branch. And then I could click Open Visual Studio Code to create, to open it in Visual Studio. And now I'm logged in on the something else branch. And if I was to refresh here, there you can see I'm on the something else branch. So your terminal and GitHub Desktop can work quite well together. I'm going to switch back to the proposed changes one. That's what I want to use, and open that in Visual Studio. So as I say, you might not have precisely the same method for your text editor, but the idea is to either use your terminal or GitHub Desktop to create the branch that you're going to work on, and then switch to that branch, and then open up that repository with that branch as the base in your text editor. Now, all I'm going to do here is a simple change. I'm just going to add a line. It could be anything, right? And I'm going to save that. So now I've made a change to my README. And so in Visual Studio, it's shown as this yellow highlight with an M. It's been modified. So it's telling you that something has happened to that file. So now I need to take this branch of mine with these changes and basically push it to GitHub so that the rest of the team can review it. And this can also be done either with the terminal or with GitHub Desktop. So if we look at GitHub Desktop as an example, you can see here it's picked up that there's a change. It's showing you what the change is, and it's showing you the file that's been changed. And so if I was to go down here to update README, I could enter some comment, whatever the comment will be that relates to what I did, and click commit. This will commit the change, and then I have the option to publish the branch, and that essentially will push the branch with my changes that have already been committed to GitHub. And once I've done that, this publish branch button will become a create pull request button, and you can then create your pull request. So that's one method that you can use. But I don't, well, actually, you know what we can do is we can show you both. So I'm going to commit this change. So you can see it's now been committed. I'm not going to do anything else with it just yet. What I'm going to do now is go here and add a second line. Right? So now that's been saved. So once again in GitHub Desktop, you can see that new change has taken effect. But I'm going to use the terminal to commit this change and then publish my branch. So in Visual Studio, I can click terminal in the top toolbar, which you can't see at the moment, and click new terminal, and that will open up a terminal within Visual Studio. And you can see I'm on the branch, I'm in my repository, and so I can say git add to add all changes that are currently waiting. And if we do git status, we can see that we have a modified README file that is waiting to be committed. So now I can commit this and say, let's say changes to README file. And now we have committed all of our changes we've made so far are committed to the README file. Now at this point, we want to push this file, this branch of ours to GitHub so that we can have it reviewed. Now, if you're using the terminal, you will use a command like this. You would use the git push command. And if your branch is not yet on GitHub, if you're pushing it for the first time, you would need to use the set upstream command or the set upstream parameter to specify the name of the branch, which in this case is proposed changes. So I've got git push, set upstream origin, and then the name of the branch. So if I do this, you can see that it has now made some changes. And if we go to our repository in GitHub, you can see it's already picked up that there's been a new branch, proposed changes. And if I refresh this page and click down on this little button here, there is our proposed changes branch. Now we've made some changes in our text editor, and we've published that new branch to GitHub. So the last thing to do is we want to open a pull request for the team to review it. And there are a number of ways that you can do this. You could, in GitHub Desktop, you could click create pull request. You could, from your terminal, create a pull request here, or on GitHub itself, you could click compare and pull request. I'm going to use the desktop version. And if I click that, it's going to open up a window which will allow me to create a sort of landing page for my changes. So let's say I want to change it to propose changes to README, and then add a description for what I'm doing and say this pull request makes some README changes. Right? You could add pictures here, you could add links, whatever you want. Really, you could add code, and it will show you. Can't quite see it in the on my screen right now, but it will show you whatever changes are in your pull request. You can also see them once you've created it, and so you can add other things on the side here. You can add labels, you can add particular people in your team who you want to review it if you want. But once you're ready, you can click Create Pull Request. And so here you can see we have Eatsoven wants to merge 2 commits to the main branch from this proposed changes branch. Now in this particular case, we don't have any checks or anything in place, so you can see continuous integration is not set up, GitHub Actions is not running just yet. So everything passes and is green and we can merge. If you were part of a team, you would probably have some checks in place that would have to pass, and then you would need an approval from one of those team members. And once you've got the approval and the checks pass, you would have this green button. And of course, up top here, you can see a few things. You have your commits that you made along the line while you were doing your changes, and you have the changes. In this case, it's just one file that's had a few changes made to it, but if there were more, they would all be one after the other. So all I now have to do is to click Merge Pull Request and confirm that change, and it has been successfully merged to the main branch. And then if I want, I can click Delete Branch to get rid of the old one. It's no longer there. So now if I go to the main page of this branch, you see we now have a modified README. So that's essentially how you would propose new changes in a team setting. You create a branch, you make your changes on that branch, you push that branch to GitHub, and then you create a pull request so that your team can review what you've done. Assuming you're part of an organization or some sort of system that you might have configured, there would be checks that would have to pass, and you would need approvals from at least one team member in order to move forward with merging. But once you merge, those changes then become part of the main branch of the repository, and then you carry on to the next change that you want to make. So that's a brief introduction to how you can collaborate using pull requests. In the next lecture, in this section, I want to just touch on 1 or 2 other ways that you can use GitHub features to work with your team and collaborate effectively. I'll see you there. Thank you for taking the time to work through this video. I hope that you found it particularly useful. Remember, the entire course is available here on YouTube and also on Udemy, and I've linked the Udemy one in the description below. You can also find my course on GitHub Actions on Udemy if you're interested in diving deeper into GitHub Actions. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video and perhaps subscribing to the channel to look for future updates. Thank you so much for your time, and have a lovely day further.